Thank you, Diana. My name is Derk Bransen, and together with Marjan Govaerts, Dominique Sluismans, and Erik Driessen, we're conducting this research project which is titled Facilitating Self-Regulated Learning in Clinical Clerkships Through Co-Regulated Learning. And I will talk about the context in which this research project is situated. I will zoom in on self and co-regulated learning, and then I will briefly discuss the research aim and the first study, which is currently under review for ethical approval. So, the context in which it takes place. Being a physician or being a doctor is often described as being as a self-regulatory profession, but what does this mean, a self-regulatory profession? Well, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education states that residents and faculty members, they must demonstrate an understanding of their personal role in attention to lifelong learning by developing skills and habits that allow continuous patient improvement through constant self-evaluation. So when you state these requirements for faculty members and residents, it seems only logical that you start developing these skills early in undergraduate medical education. And I think, in fact, here in Maastricht, we do in the bachelor program, in which students are acquainted with self-regulated learning through the problem-based learning approach. And in the master program, they need these self-regulated learning skills in order to proactively shape their personal and professional development. And this is where this research project is situated, in the master's program of undergraduate medical education, when students are enrolled in rotating clerkships. And this can be quite a daunting experience for students, submerging themselves for the first time in clinical practice, as is clearly evidenced by this medical student who seems completely flustered with the clinical practice. So let's zoom in on self-regulated learning. Self-regulation is always going to be a challenge, but if somebody's going to be in charge, it might as well be me. And I think this highlights the essence of self-regulation, self-regulated learning. It's about taking ownership, taking charge, taking control, being at the steering wheel of your own learning processes. So many models have conceptualized self-regulated learning. This model is from Zimmerman, who conceptualizes it as a three-phase model, a forethought phase, which precedes task performance. Goal setting and strategic planning are important here. A performance phase, which refers to the processes that are active during actual task performance. And a self-reflection phase, and these are the processes that follow task performance. But as I just said, many models are present of self-regulated learning. This is a model of Butler and colleagues, which situates self-regulated learning within the learning environment in which it takes place. Another model from Butler and colleagues, which emphasizes that this self-regulated learning cycle is triggered by some form of knowledge gap or skills gap. And there are many more models, I think, and I've not included all of them, of course. So, in short, I think the common denominators of self-regulated learning models or of self-regulated learning is that it's an active process. It's an active and conscious process in which learners should engage. It's cyclical in that the outcomes of self-reflection and self-evaluation, they should drive future learning, so they should drive formulating learning objectives. So this is a self-oriented feedback loop. It's goal-directed. These processes are aligned with the self-set goals. And last but not least, it's context-dependent. And self-regulated learning models, they incorporate context to varying degrees into their models, ranging from the more socio-cognitive models, which heavily zoom in on internal cognitive processes of the individual, to the more socio-cultural models that emphasize interaction in the context in which it takes place. So that results in the following definition of Zimmerman of self-regulated learning. It's quite a mouthful. But I think all the elements are also it's active and constructive. Learners set goals, and they attempt to monitor, regulate, and control cognition, behavior, and motivation, guided and constrained by their goals and contextual features on the environment. So, in sum, well, let's zoom in on why should we self-regulate learning? What are the benefits and what are the challenges? So, self-regulated learning has been widely linked to optimal functioning across a range of disciplines and content areas. It's been associated with maintenance of mental and physical health. And within the academic setting, it's been positively associated to academic achievement. And it's been associated to a more effective way of knowledge acquisition and as effective in skills and attitudes acquisition as other forms of learning. But of course, there are challenges with self-regulated learning, especially in the clinical context. So a study by Van der Wiel and her colleagues showed that physicians' learning is sometimes a bit implicit and reactive, which might suggest that transfer of self-regulated learning skills to practice may be problematic, or that the context only allows self-regulated learning to a certain extent. And then when medical students, they engage in clinical practice, they must learn to balance patient care, which is of course more important, or the most it's prioritized, with educational purposes. They must balance patient care with learning, which is often very challenging. And the clinical context can be a bit messy. There's often a lack of direct observation and observation-based feedback. And feedback is often also can serve as an input factor for a self-regulated learning cycle. So self-regulated learning is in the clinical context is challenging, and it's affected by influenced by many factors. It's influenced by self-motivational beliefs such as learning goal orientations and self-efficacy, but it's also affected by the learning climate and the time and opportunities that are available. And last but not least, it's influenced by interactions with others in the environment. And I'd like to zoom in on this last point. Self-regulated learning and interaction with others in the environment. A study by Joris Berghout showed that novice students, so students who are new to clinical practice, they mainly require peers and residents to formulate adequate learning objectives and to help them to self-reflect on learning activities. Whereas more experienced students, who have more experience in clinical practice, they need peers to a lesser extent, and they seek out help from a consultant or specialist or more experienced physicians, and they shift away from goal setting, and they shift towards finding adequate learning opportunities and strategies. And when medical students are enrolled in these clerkships, they often have a mentor, and this mentor can be valuable in stimulating self-reflection. So these are a few examples of how others in the clinical environment influence self-regulated learning. So now, we know that interactions with others in the environment, they influence self-regulated learning, and that self-regulated learning is effectuated within this clinical context. And the reciprocal relationship between self-regulated learning and the environment is embodied or captured by this concept of co-regulated learning. And co-regulated learning reflects a more social-cultural oriented learning theory, and emphasizes that learners are continuously influenced by the environment in which they act, while at the same time they're co-producing and co-creating this environment or the surroundings in which they work. So this is the reciprocal relationship of the environment and the learner. Well, co-regulated learning is defined as a transitional process towards the acquisition of self-regulation strategies through interactions with a more capable other. And essential to co-regulated learning are social transactions with others in the environment. So these are peers, more experienced students, residents, consultants, but also patients, families. And through these social interactions, their learning processes, including their self-regulated learning processes of goal setting, performance monitoring, self-reflection, are mediated or are distributed between these two participants, so to speak. So an example would be when a resident or any other clinical teacher helps a medical students by providing the adequate stimuli for self-reflection. And by doing so, they share or they distribute or co-regulate self-evaluation. So what's important, or a key component of co-regulated learning, is that regulation is shared through these processes of scaffolding. And these are processes that, so students and a more capable other, this can be a more experienced student or a resident, they cooperate in a shared activity that the student cannot do on its own, but is capable of doing with the help of the more capable other. And then by jointly engaging in these activities, the cognitive and the metacognitive activities are distributed or shared between these two participants. And scaffolding then should be based on intersubjectivity, which refers to a mutual understanding or mutual agreement about the goals, the strategies, and other actions that are performed during co-regulation of learning. So we've constructed or adopted a model, at least in part from research conducted in primary and secondary classroom settings. And we've positioned processes of self-regulated learning at the heart of the model, because learning is still, at least in part, an individual process, but it's affected by interactions with others in the environment. Interactions with peers influence the manifestation and development of self-regulated learning. The more experienced others influence the manifestation and development of self-regulated learning. And the overall learning climate and a learning culture can have an impact on self-regulated learning. So this is then the resulting proposed model of co-regulated learning in clinical clerkships environments. And what is important, I think, is that self-regulated learning is not performed within a vacuum. It's not an isolated thing, but instead it's embedded in the social interaction in which it takes place, and is almost always co-regulated or co-determined by other forms of regulatory interaction in the environment. And from research in classroom settings, we know that this acquisition of self-regulated learning skills is accompanied by some form of shifting control, ranging from the more teacher-directed regulation in which the teacher is either demonstrating or performing self-regulated learning, to co-regulation, in which is distributed, to student-centered regulation, in which the student more or less autonomously self-regulates. So, facilitating self-regulated learning through co-regulated learning in the clinical context is a complex and highly individual and context-specific process. And the complexity of the clinical environment can hinder or facilitate the manifestation of co-regulated learning and therefore self-regulated learning. And this has resulted in the following overarching research aim, is that we want to gain a thorough understanding of co-regulated learning in these clerkships and how, when, and why it contributes to the development of self-regulated learning. So I'd like to zoom in on our first study, which is currently under review for ethical approval. And research on co-regulated learning within this clinical setting is rather limited. So our first study is explorative in nature. And we want to zoom in on the perspectives of students of co-regulated learning and how do they perceive co-regulated learning to impact development of their self-regulated learning skills. And to construct a clear picture, we've included a subset of questions. We want to zoom in on what are their perspectives on co-regulated learning and self-regulated learning in the first place, because this may be concepts which are hard to pin down. And how, maybe more importantly, how do they conceive or perceive their own role and responsibility in self-regulated learning? And last but not least, of course, we want to see how these interactions they are engaging in and impact the development of self-regulated learning. We aim to conduct a qualitative grounded theory approach in which we will use semi-structured interviews using sensitizing concept, acknowledging existing theories and concepts in co-regulated learning and self-regulated learning. We will select a minimum of 15 participants based on performance as evidenced in their portfolios. We think it may give us a measure of ability to self-regulate learning. So we want some people with a higher assessment of their portfolio and maybe a bit more moderate or lower. And we will select a participant based on experience in clinical training, because we know that with engaging in clinical training and adding on to your clinical experience, it comes a growing realization that you must take charge of your online learning processes. This results in a first, second, and third year master students in clinical practice. These are more or less the themes we want to zoom in on in the interview. So what role do others play in their learning in general? How do they take charge of their own learning? What are their ideas about that? And how do others help them in taking charge? And how do they seek out others in order to take charge over their own learning processes? So this is a short overview of my research proposal and the first study. And I've been thinking about incorporating an observation-based data collection method, because co-regulated learning, self-regulated learning may be concepts which are hard to pin down for students, and they might not be aware of co-regulated learning processes they're engaging in already. So I was thinking about maybe including some form of observation. So I'd like to pick your brain on this issue, and of course any other feedback or questions are more than welcome. Thank you for your attention.